Hello everybody and welcome back to another video. I'm SocietySucks and today I'm checking out every major US war crime in 20 minutes by the Paint Explainer. Now this video only contains like 10 war crimes done by the US, most of which I assume the US received absolutely no punishment for, because when is the US ever punished for their crimes? Pretty much never. I'm not even going to look at the comments in this video because I already know it's just going to be a bunch of Russia, China and Middle Eastern simps who try to paint the US as worse than those countries, but let's be honest, China, Russia, and pretty much most Middle Eastern countries are just as bad as the US in terms of war crimes. Or maybe worse, I don't know. Anyway, enough about that, let's actually see these 10 war crimes that the US committed.
My Lai Massacre. On the 16th of March 1968, in the Vietnamese village called Sun Mai, U.S. soldiers carried out what became the largest massacre of civilians by American forces in the 20th century. Between 347 and 504 unarmed villagers, most of them women, children, and the elderly, were killed. Many women and girls, some as young as 12, were raped before being murdered.
Of course.
Bodies were mutilated, homes were burned, and livestock was slaughtered. Witnesses described women using their bodies to shield children, only for soldiers to fire into them.
Yeah, I don't think that was going to work.
More than 70 dead. Then, platoons went hut to hut, killing entire families, bayoneting the wounded, and throwing grenades. Soldiers later testified that their orders had been to destroy everything, leave nothing, and treat anyone still there as the enemy. One soldier intentionally shot himself in the foot to avoid taking part. A few, like Michael Bernhardt, refused to kill and later helped expose what happened. The massacre might have been even worse if not for Warrant Officer Hugh Thompson Jr. and his helicopter crew. Flying low over the village, they saw women and children being slaughtered, and at one point, Thompson landed between U.S. soldiers and terrified civilians, ordering his own gunners to fire on Americans if they kept killing. He personally evacuated survivors by helicopter, saving dozens. At first, the massacre was reported as a great victory, claiming that 128 Viet Cong were killed, and the unit was congratulated. Officers up the chain of command worked to hide the truth, but later on, when veterans like Ronald Ridenhour spoke out and journalist Seymour Hersh investigated, the world learned the real story. When photographs surfaced showing women, children, and babies piled in ditches, what happened could no longer be denied. In the end, 26 soldiers were charged, but only one, Lieutenant Calley, was convicted. He was found guilty of murdering 22 villagers and sentenced to life in prison, but he served 3.5 years under house arrest after President Nixon intervened. Medina, accused of giving the orders, was acquitted. Most others escaped punishment. Survivors, many of them children at the time, carried the trauma for decades. One recalled, "Everyone in my family was killed. They threw me into a ditch full of dead bodies. I was covered with blood and brains." Haditha Massacre.
Okay, so that was just the first one, between 300 and 500 people. Yeah, that's pretty terrible. But if this is a major US war crime, then it doesn't seem that bad, I guess. I mean, it's horrible, but 300 to 500 people, like, that's nothing. I don't want to make it seem like it's not a bad thing, but 300 to 500 people doesn't really compare to some of the biggest war crimes I've ever heard of, so we're starting off a bit weak.
On the morning of November 19th, 2005, in the Iraqi town of Haditha, a roadside bomb tore through a U.S. Marine convoy.
So we're talking about Iraq here.
The explosion killed a Marine instantly and left 2 other Marines badly wounded. Within hours, that turned into one of the darkest chapters of the Iraq War. The Marines shot 5 unarmed men who had been ordered out of their taxi, killing them on the spot. Then, they entered nearby houses. Inside were families with grandparents, parents, and children as young as 1 year old.
So they just started killing random people?
19 civilians were killed in their homes, most shot at close range in the chest or head. By the end of the day, 25 unarmed civilians were dead, with the youngest victim being just 3 years old. The Marine Corps' first official story was false. They claimed that 15 civilians had been killed by the roadside bomb, and that 8 insurgents died in a firefight afterward. However, an Iraqi human rights worker filmed the aftermath: bullet holes in walls, bloodstains on floors, and bodies of women and children with gunshot wounds.
The official story was that it was a bunch of terrorists they killed, plus some civilians who got caught in the crossfire because of the bomb. But I'm guessing that this was just purely revenge for the Marine they lost, because one of the Marines died and 2 were wounded, and I'm guessing that the rest decided that they were going to take revenge on some poor innocent civilians.
platoons. A Time magazine reporter then began investigating and found that doctors at the local hospital confirmed that none of the bodies showed bomb injuries, but close-range gunshot wounds.
It would not be difficult to confirm
that.
that.
A 9-year-old girl who survived said she saw her grandfather shot first in the chest and then in the head, followed by her grandmother. Investigations stretched on for years, and at first, 8 Marines were charged, but case after case collapsed. Some Marines received immunity in exchange for testimony, while others had their charges dropped. By 2008,
of course they did.
Nearly all charges were gone, and the only Marine punished was Vuteric. He admitted to negligent dereliction of duty, lost rank and pay, but avoided jail. For many Iraqis, this outcome was
not a
unbearable,
punishment,
as families who had lost multiple relatives in one morning saw 6 years of U.S. military prosecution end without a single Marine imprisoned. Survivors called it an assault on humanity. Lawyers for the victims urged international courts to take up the case.
It's the U.S. They're never going to get punished for anything.
$38,000 in compensation to some families. Samar campaign. Kill everyone.
People in your family were killed. Here's some money. That'll solve the issue.
And over the age of 10. Those were the words of General Jacob H. Smith during the Philippine-American War in what became known as the pacification of Samar. His order did not apply only to armed enemy fighters, but to everyone, as he wanted to turn the island into, in his own words, a howling wilderness. The situation leading up to this was already tense, as just months earlier, Filipino fighters together with local townspeople had carried out the Balangiga massacre, where in a surprise attack, they killed 54 and wounded 18 U.S. soldiers. That's when the U.S. government sent General Smith to Samar, who made it clear that he wanted no prisoners.
So this is once again just revenge.
Of bearing arms to be killed. When Marines asked him what exactly capable of bearing arms meant,
everybody
Smith
who could take up a
boys
weapon
as young as 10 years old. Waller himself, the major leading these Marines, partly resisted these instructions, telling some of his officers not to target women and children. Still, over just 11 days, he reported that his men burned 255 homes and killed 39 people. Civilians saw their towns and food reduced to ashes. The number of deaths will never be fully known, but broader estimates suggest around 2,000 to 2,500 civilians were killed. The campaign became infamous in the United States once reports reached home, and Smith was put on trial in May 1902.
Let me guess, nothing happened.
Or war crimes. Instead, he was found guilty only of conduct to the prejudice of good order and military discipline, a minor charge. His punishment was just a formal reprimand. To calm public anger, he was quietly forced into retirement. Waller himself was also later put on trial for ordering the execution of Filipino porters, but he was acquitted. Nisour Square Massacre. This one was different from the others.
No idea what this one is.
And not by the regular U.S. Army, but by a private contractor known as Blackwater, which made it even more controversial. On a normal morning in September 2007...
Wait, I mean, if it's a private contractor, then how does this count as a U.S. war crime? It's a private contractor, no?
A Blackwater convoy drove into Nisour Square in Baghdad to clear a route for U.S.
Once again, Iraq.
Moments later, though, out of nowhere, they opened fire on Iraqi civilians. 17 people were killed.
Just like that?
20 more were wounded. Some were shot while still sitting in their cars. For example, witnesses described one small Kia with a mother and her adult son inside. The son was shot in the head, and the car kept moving forward and was riddled with more bullets before a grenade set it on fire. Blackwater claimed the convoy had been ambushed and that the guards fired in self-defense, but the Iraqi government called it an unprovoked attack. The State Department admitted that innocent people had been killed, and Iraq suspended Blackwater's license to operate in its territory and demanded accountability. Several investigations began, and a U.S. military report supported Iraq's version of events, saying Blackwater was at fault. The FBI concluded that at least 14 of the 17 people killed had been shot without justification. Some Blackwater guards themselves told investigators that the shooting was wrong. One guard even kept firing after others shouted for him to stop, until another contractor aimed his weapon at him to force him to stand down. The massacre raised questions about the role of private military contractors, and Iraq demanded punishment for Blackwater and pressed for compensation.
I mean, how do you even deal with a private military contractor? Like, are they even... Like, whose orders do they follow? Who are they under? And how do they get punishment? What can they do and what can't they do? Are the rules different for them? Because technically they're not a part of the US military, no? Since they're independent?
In the US, the House passed a bill to bring contractors under US criminal law in war zones, though the Senate did not vote on it. Then, the State Department told Blackwater its security contract would not be renewed. And years later, the case reached U.S. courts. In 2014, 4 Blackwater guards were convicted in federal court. One of them was sentenced to life in prison, while the others received 30 years each under firearms laws. There were some appeals, but in the end, the man originally sentenced to life was once again given life in prison, while the other 3 had their sentences reduced to about half of what they were before. Later on, however, there was a final twist. In December 2020, President Donald Trump pardoned all 4 men. The decision triggered outrage in Iraq and harsh criticism from United Nations experts.
I'm not surprised.
Who said the pardons violated U.S. obligations under international law.
It's Trump.
Abu Ghraib.
Why? Why did Trump pardon them? That's the guy who's currently president in the US. Just remember that. And remember all the other shit he's done since he became president in 2024. Well, 2025. Makes me wonder what else he's gonna do. What other kind of stunts he's gonna pull.
The photos from Abu Ghraib are widely known around the world for how disturbing they look, but the background is even darker. To the public, Abu Ghraib was a normal detention and interrogation facility, but it wasn't at all. Inside, there was sexual humiliation to lengths we can't go to for obvious reasons. Torture.
Yeah, YouTube won't allow it.
There was even the killing of Manadel al-Jamadi, whose body was packed in ice.
No idea who any of these people are.
Soldiers posing beside it. The shock was immediate and worldwide, so the Bush administration answered quickly, saying that these were isolated acts by a few rogue soldiers. However, organizations like the Red Cross, Amnesty International, and Human Rights Watch said the opposite, claiming this was part of a larger pattern across U.S. prisons in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Guantanamo. The Red Cross also reported that most Abu Ghraib detainees were civilians with no connection to armed groups. Then, internal documents showed how they were given approval for what were called enhanced interrogation techniques. These
basically
documents
torture.
would be later known as the torture memos, for reasons you can imagine.
Of course.
They argued that the Geneva Conventions didn't apply overseas and didn't classify the detainees as prisoners of war, which allowed them to hold people longer without charges and deny them the rights normally given to prisoners of war. Other orders showed Lieutenant General Ricardo Sanchez authorizing the use of dogs, extreme heat and cold, reversed sleep cycles, and sensory deprivation. Inside the cells, prisoners were stripped naked and forced into humiliating poses, threatened with dogs, beaten, shackled in painful
So not just physical, but also mental torture.
And warmth, and forced into sexual acts. Taguba recorded one prisoner sodomized with a chemical light. Detainees spoke of acid poured on their skin, being dragged by ropes tied to their genitals, and being mocked. Manadel al-Jamadi, whose death was ruled a homicide, never led to any criminal charges. At the same time, 36 detainees died in insurgent mortar attacks on the prison, which critics said violated the Geneva rule that prisoners should not be kept in active combat zones. In 2006, the Supreme...
Honestly, the ones that were killed in that insurgent mortar bomb, they were probably lucky because they were probably spared from more torture.
The Supreme Court ruled that the Geneva Conventions did apply, and 17 soldiers and officers
Of course it did. They apply everywhere.
While 11 were court-martialed.
They should.
Punishments varied. One guy got 10 years, some 3, and others shorter sentences, or even just reprimands or demotions. External contractors, such as the company CACI Premier Technology, also came under scrutiny. Pretty recently, in 2024, a jury found them liable for conspiring with military police to soften up prisoners through abuse, awarding 3 former detainees $42 million in damages. Jurors concluded that CACI interrogators facilitated mistreatment even if they did not personally carry it out. Operation Speedy Express. This was one of the most...
You know, this video really makes me think about what's happening in Ukraine right now. You know, the Russia-Ukraine war. Just how many war crimes have happened there, and the people who committed them will never be punished. Although then again, a good portion of the people who did commit them are probably already dead. And some are confirmed dead.
Most brutal and controversial U.S. campaigns of the Vietnam War. You can get an idea of what really happened when you hear that the Army reported about 11,000 enemy kills, but recovered only 750 weapons from the dead. Operation Speedy Express, carried out from December 1968 to May 1969, and run under Major General Julian Ewell, had the official goal of destroying Viet Cong bases, cutting supply lines, and re-establishing U.S. control over a region considered a stronghold of the Viet Cong, the Mekong Delta. On paper, the operation looked like an overwhelming success, considering that just
you killed 11,000 people.
American soldiers died, while the enemy lost 11,000. With a
But they
ratio
weren't
of 45
soldiers.
to 1, it looked like a decisive victory, but the numbers hid something darker. The fact that only about 750 weapons were recovered means that thousands of those killed were probably unarmed civilians. The Army's own Inspector General later estimated that between 5,000 and 7,000 civilians were killed during the operation. The campaign relied on
I'd say
overwhelming
more than
firepower,
that.
like helicopter gunships, artillery barrages, and fighter bomber strikes, in a heavily crowded region with civilians. This basically turned entire areas into free fire zones. David Hackworth, a highly decorated battalion commander, admitted openly, "A lot of innocent Vietnamese civilians got slaughtered because of the Yule Hunt drive to have the highest body count in the land." Survivors and witnesses described whole villages
So they
wiped
just
out
wanted
with
high body
civilians getting
counts.
shot from the air as they tried to run. A Viet Cong commander later explained, "Most of the people killed were civilians because civilians would run. We soldiers held our positions." Reports of atrocities began to surface in 1969, but they were overshadowed by the My Lai massacre, which we've just talked about. In 1972, Newsweek published an investigation by...
So one massacre was overshadowed by another massacre which was of a different scale. Actually, that's really fucked up. The My Lai massacre was way smaller. It was, what, 300 to 500 people. This was 11,000. How did that one, which was smaller, cover up this one? That's weird as hell.
Kevin Buckley and Alexander Shimkin, called Pacification's Deadly Price. They had interviewed villagers and studied hospital records. In one provincial hospital, they found that 3/4 of the civilian wounds treated came from US firepower, not Viet Cong attacks. Their conclusion was that thousands of civilians had been killed during Speedy Express. No Gun Ri Massacre. In the summer of 1950, during the Korean War, one of its darkest tragedies took place at a railway bridge near the village of No Gun Ri. US commanders were afraid that North Korean soldiers were disguising themselves as civilians, so they ordered refugee movements to...
That is a legitimate fear. As bad as it sounds, that is a legitimate fear because disguising... North Koreans could very easily disguise themselves as South Korean civilians or vice versa. Because they all look the fucking same. But still, firing on them without... Firing on civilians who could be North Koreans who are disguising themselves, you can't fire on them unless you have actual proof that they are North Korean soldiers.
Be blocked. Declassified documents later showed that some commands actually went even further, authorizing troops to fire on groups of civilians who approached. Then, disaster struck. As waves of refugees fled south from the advancing North Korean army, they reached US lines. There, they were stopped, searched, and grouped near the railway tracks by No Gun Ri. American planes then shot at them. Survivors say ground troops soon opened fire
But they
too,
were
driving them
searched.
into the culverts and pinning them down in the bridge underpasses. Hundreds of South Korean refugees, mostly women, children, and the elderly, were caught under fire, and for 3 days, families screamed as they piled bodies on top of one another for cover, drank from a stream turned red with blood, and watched children die beside them. The death toll has long been debated, with survivors speaking of about 400
They were
people killed,
searched.
and U.S. veterans giving numbers ranging from dozens to several hundred. A South Korean government inquiry
They were searched. They knew they weren't North Korean soldiers hiding. And they still did it.
was able to confirm 163 people dead or missing by name, along with 55 wounded, and concluded that the real toll was likely much higher, around 250 to 300. Nearly half of the confirmed victims were children. For decades, the story was silenced, as survivors lived in fear under South Korea's authoritarian governments. It was not until 1999 that the Associated Press exposed the story worldwide, interviewing survivors and U.S. veterans. The reporting won a Pulitzer Prize and forced both the U.S. and South Korean governments to investigate. The U.S. Army's 2001 report admitted that civilians had been killed by American air and ground fire, but claimed there had been no orders to deliberately massacre them. It described the killings as a tragic accident of war. President Bill Clinton expressed deep regret and admitted things happened which were wrong. Instead of compensation, the U.S. funded a memorial and scholarships, which survivors rejected. South Korean investigators, however,
you think they care about that stuff?
Almost certainly been orders to fire, pointing to missing records, consistent testimony, and orders from the time to treat refugees as enemy agents. Later, more declassified documents strengthened the case. One was a letter dated July 26, 1950, from the U.S. ambassador in Seoul, reporting that the U.S. military had adopted a policy of shooting refugee groups approaching its lines. This and other incriminating records had been deliberately left out of the Army's official report. No Gun Ri also set off wider investigations in South Korea, uncovering more than 200 other cases of alleged U.S. killings of civilians in the early years of the war, including refugee bombings and mass executions. Sand Creek Massacre. On November 29th,
I think I've heard of this.
1864, troops under Colonel John Chivington
Sand
rode
Creek
toward
sounds
a Native
familiar.
American camp of the Cheyenne and Arapaho people. Chief Black Kettle had moved his people there after being told it was safe, and he raised a U.S. flag with a white flag underneath it to show peace. Many of the warriors were away, and most of the people in camp were too old or too young to fight. Despite this, Chivington's soldiers attacked. Witnesses later described women and children being shot at close range, people cut apart with knives, babies killed, and bodies mutilated for trophies. One account told of a child wandering in the sand, while soldiers took turns trying to shoot him. Another described fingers and ears cut off for jewelry, and the body of Chief White Antelope butchered. By the time the killing ended, most of the dead were women and children. Chivington claimed that 500 to 600 warriors were killed, boasting about the number, but other sources said the real number was closer to 150, with about 2/3 women and children. The soldiers suffered far fewer losses. Before leaving, they looted the lodges and returned to kill some of the wounded. The reason why this massacre happened in the first place is even sadder. In the 1851 Fort Laramie Treaty, the U.S. recognized a large Cheyenne and Arapaho homeland. But after the Colorado Gold Rush and new migration,
they decided to take the land.
More land than was agreed, and a small group of chiefs signed the Fort Wise Treaty, ceding most of the land to appease the U.S. Many Cheyenne, though, rejected it as invalid, and tensions rose. The governor told friendly Indians to gather near forts in order to stay safe, and Colonel Chivington himself, while he declared openly that he had come to kill Indians, told those seeking peace to come under military protection at Fort Lyon. That's exactly what Black Kettle did, following his instructions,
and then they were killed.
People were pushed out. He still believed the U.S. and white flags would protect them, but the massacre happened. In Colorado and Washington, the story was first reported as a victory, but the truth quickly surfaced.
It was
investigations
planned.
followed, including a congressional inquiry that called it a
He
foul
gathered them
and
there on
dastardly
purpose.
massacre. Officers and scouts testified about the killings and mutilations. Captain Soule, who had refused to fire, gave evidence and was murdered shortly after in Denver. Despite the findings, no one was court-martialed. Chivington had already resigned, and while his career ended in disgrace, he avoided legal punishment. A later treaty at the Little
How is that possible?
promised survivors land access and reparations, but those promises were soon broken and replaced with much smaller reservations. Philippines concentration camps. During the Philippine-American War, concentration camps were used in Batangas, and one American officer described them as some suburb of hell. You'll soon understand why. Back then, General James Franklin Bell took command of U.S. forces in that area, and his goal was to starve the rebels and cut them off from any support. However, since there were many civilians there, they decided to put them into heavily guarded camps, as their homes, fields, and animals were destroyed. All civilians were required to carry identification papers.
Couldn't you just evacuate them somewhere else?
The camps without them could be shot on the spot. Bell himself said neutrality should not be tolerated, which meant that everyone was either an enemy or a friend, and anyone accused of helping the rebels risked execution. Conditions inside the camps were catastrophic. People were packed together in crowded spaces with poor sanitation, which made diseases spread quickly. Cholera, smallpox,
really just sounds like some modern-day prisons.
Bubonic plague killed
in
thousands.
Certain countries.
Food was also scarce, and some soldiers described groups of men being
mainly
forced
South
to
America
dig their
and
own
Asia,
graves before being executed,
Africa
with the
probably
excuse
as well.
that keeping them alive would take food away from U.S. troops. Torture was also performed, such as waterboarding. The death toll was incredible. Between January and April 1902, 8,350 people died in the camps. In some camps, as many as 1 out of every 5 prisoners died. To calm public anger in the United States, the Army's top public relations officer tried to defend the camps. He claimed they were meant to protect friendly natives, feed them, and teach them better hygiene. However, this claim collapsed when reports from inside the camp surfaced, with letters from soldiers and witnesses. Wounded Knee Massacre. Before sunrise at Wounded Knee Creek, cavalry surrounded the Native American band of Lakota
once again,
and began
the natives.
collecting their guns. Tension grew as soldiers searched the people, and a deaf Lakota man named Black Coyote held onto his rifle, and during a struggle, it went off. In that instant, soldiers opened fire on the entire camp, even though most Lakota men had already been disarmed. The Army's Hotchkiss guns fired into the tents where women and children were hiding. In less than an hour, more than 250 Lakota were killed or fatally wounded. 25 U.S. soldiers were also killed. Survivors tried to flee, but they were chased and shot, and some soldiers finished off the wounded where they lay. A blizzard followed the massacre, and 3 days later, civilians
well, at least they had the decency to finish them off instead of letting them bleed out slowly.
Gathered the frozen bodies and placed them in a mass grave. 4 infants were found alive, still wrapped in their mother's shawls. The Army removed Colonel Forsyth, who had led the operation, but later reinstated him. An inquiry criticized his tactics, but did not blame him. 19 medals of honor were then awarded for Wounded Knee. Native leaders and many others have condemned those awards for decades, but most recently, in 2025, the Defense Secretary announced the medals would not be revoked. If you want
Of
to
course.
discuss this
Of course
video or
not. You killed a bunch of people who were laying down their weapons and were basically innocent. Here's your Medal of Honor. I do have to say, the numbers in these war crimes are quite low. I honestly expected them to be a lot higher, within the 30s or 40,000, maybe more, but not a single one of them went to 20k. I mean, obviously, they're all still horrible. Every war crime is terrible and it's just disgusting, but the numbers were much lower than I had expected. You shouldn't really compare one country's war crimes to another, but just comparing the numbers, the war crimes the US has committed, the numbers are pretty low. I expected far more. I mean, when we look at the numbers of what Japan did during World War II, what the Germans did during World War II, and what the Russians did during World War II, the US numbers are very low. That doesn't make them any better, but the numbers just don't compare. I mean, one war crime committed by the Russians that I can think about off the top of my head is the Katyn massacre, where they killed over 20,000 Polish soldiers. They drove them out in trains further east and then killed them, put them in mass graves, which were later dug up because they were found by the Germans when they invaded Russia. And I mean, recently, there were, where was it? I think it was Izium, where they found graves of Ukrainian civilians murdered by the Russians. Yeah, war crimes still happen everywhere around the world. I wonder how long this video is going to stay up, because based on the topic that it's covering, I'm going to assume it's going to be either completely taken down or just shadow banned so that it doesn't get recommended to anyone. It's only been up for what, like 7 days? Yeah, 7 days. It's probably not going to stay here for long. I mean, yeah, it was a good video. It explained quite a lot. Obviously it's a short video. It didn't go very in-depth, but that would make this video hours long. I mean, yeah, in conclusion, the US committed a lot of war crimes, which the perpetrators weren't punished for, which unfortunately happens a lot, with not just the US, but many other countries as well. It's just how it is, unfortunately. So yeah, that's it for this video. Hope you enjoyed. If you did, please consider subscribing and leaving a like. If you want to see more reactions, check out this video right here, and with that, I'll see you in the next video.